I'm turning this over to Laura Ferricks, AURP board member and with the University of Illinois Research Park, and she's going to lead the session on accelerating entrepreneurial ecosystems, lessons from MIT REAP and other regional entrepreneurship programs. Laura.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Making it to week 4, session 4. We wish we were all amongst the orange trees, but it's nice to see everybody's faces. So thanks for coming back. Today, we're joined by a rockstar team from MIT that's gonna do an exercise with us that I hope you'll enjoy. It will be interactive, and you do have homework. If you did not see already, there is a worksheet for today's session. So you received an email. Diana might be able to put the document in the chat, or I will try to do that when our speakers begin. You will need that worksheet for part of the exercise. So if you have a printer, print it. If not, just keep it up on your screen. They've provided it as a Word document to help us be able to work on it on the fly. This session is going to be led by Professor Scott Stern, but I am also going to introduce Travis Hunter, who's been working with us on this session. So if you're not familiar or haven't heard, this is the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, MIT REAP. And if you look at their work, they work with communities across the world. I was really excited to see that they've worked in such a global aspect from locations such as Lebanon, Japan, Kentucky, Norway, Puerto Rico, all over the place, of helping them think about how they can build entrepreneurial communities. And Professor Stern's work particularly focuses on innovation and entrepreneurship being different than other types of economic development. So when they work with communities, Travis told us some things that are really their focus, which I think they will tell us more about. And that includes authenticity and creating real competitive advantages. How do we look at our respective locations and understand whether they are really an advantage, what types of strategies we should pursue in the geographies and communities we're in. And part of that analysis, as they'll describe, is about stakeholder engagement, making sure you're listening to your stakeholders. I know in our breakout group, we were just talking about government interactions that might influence what we can do as research parks moving forward, or universities, and understanding diverse communities, as we talked about last week in DEI, that not all these things are just about what we're trying to do within our little tech bubble, but we've got to think about the greater environment and the stakeholders. And then they really will talk about data-driven strategies, using empirical evidence to be able to drive these strategies, not just anecdotal, and the innovation-driven ecosystems that this might help foster. So thank you, Travis, for agreeing to introduce your team. We have Kelly, we have Molly, we have Scott, we have Travis, and I think they're all going to break out different components of this. He is the associate director and works with to implement strategies with their partners. He's been at MIT since 2016, and he works with both private and public organizations to expand their programming. Travis, introduce us to your REAP team.
Great. Thank you, Laura. That was a kind introduction. So hello, everyone. Pleasure to meet you virtually. My name is Travis Hunter, as Laura mentioned. I direct the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. REAP is a 2-year initiative at MIT where we work with regions across the world and how they support their local innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem. For today, we are going to focus on an excerpt from our program as it relates specifically to all of your research parks. And we hope that this exercise and session will be able to give you some insights into what you might be able to do next as you return. So very quickly, I am also joined by a number of other colleagues, Molly Leffen, Rose Agriboa, Kelly Becker, both with me. All 3 of us are going to be able to jump between the breakout rooms and help you during that session when you're working on things. If you have questions, feel free to message any one of us and Laura. And then with that, I'm going to introduce our main speaker, Professor Scott Stern. Scott is the David Sarnoff Professor of Management at the Sloan School of Management. He's also the faculty director of the Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship, as well as faculty director for MIT REAP. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Well, thank you, Travis. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, everyone here. And thank you, Molly and Kelly and the entire REAP team. It is just a delight being here. Let me share my screen. That I've hopefully gotten reasonably good at this during the pandemic, so we should be ready to go in just a second here. Great. You guys can see everything? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you all so much. And as Travis and Laura already hinted at. What we're going to do here is give you a little bit of a sense of, I think, a challenge and an agenda that I think many of you will be familiar with, which is sort of how do you move beyond kind of traditional economic development and move more towards innovation and entrepreneurship in the area of your university research parks, and also how some of the lessons that we've drawn from now over a decade of the regional entrepreneurship acceleration program at MIT, as well as some of the research that's come out of that, some of the data, in particular the quantitative research on mapping entrepreneurial ecosystems. And so to do that, let me kind of set things up. My name is Scott Stern. As Travis said, I'm a professor at MIT and one of the faculty directors of the REAP program. So kind of set things up, right, is I always kind of like starting right here. This is a picture of the Santa Clara Valley, just south of Stanford, from the 1920s. And as you can see, there's just a bunch of apple orchards and a few churches in the background, so on and so forth. And if you look very carefully, about a mile north of here, you would actually be able to find the new massive Apple headquarters that was kind of debuted just a few years ago. And in some sense, right, the success and impact of Silicon Valley is something that many of you are familiar with, and kind of has led to calls around the world for their region for economic development to be, why can't our region be the next Silicon Valley? And our colleague at the Harvard Business School, and some of you will be familiar with him, Josh Lerner, he actually undertook a kind of pretty synthetic comprehensive study about a decade ago now. And Josh, is a very rigorous researcher. He's a little bit of a grumpy guy. And he kind of came out with a book that, after looking at a wide range of initiatives and activities to promote entrepreneurship at the regional level, he ended up writing a book called The Boulevard of Broken Dreams. And the Boulevard of Broken Dreams is, in some sense, right, the idea that these efforts to encourage entrepreneurship, to encourage startups, to encourage kind of idea to impact innovation, very often start with the best of intention. There's a big ribbon cutting ceremony, but it's very hard to sustain momentum and acceleration and ultimately have impact through those initiatives, at least historically. And just to kind of give you, I just want to kind of center this in, I'll come back to this towards the end. As it relates to one of our REAP teams, I'm not sure if people from there are in this audience today, but for example, just to kind of give you a very specific example, a REAP team came to us a few years ago from Macquarie Park outside of Sydney. And, they had they'd already decided to rebrand themselves from the Macquarie Park Industrial Park, where I can't remember what the last name was, to following a government-led strategy. They were going to be newly enabled innovation district. And that's, a really great idea. That sounds really exciting. And these are slides literally from their first time within the REAP program. And they were really excited about a whole bunch of things. They knew they had some real challenges, and I won't go through those in great detail, but sort of in some sense, they didn't know exactly what it was that was so special about their particular location. And they recognized that they wanted to get to a different level. They knew there were things missing in their ecosystem, but they were a little bit unsure about how to get there and how to get there effectively, how to get there recognizing the institutional, financial constraints that they faced as players within their own ecosystem, and as well to understand how they would understand if they were having impact, if they were in fact encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship at scale. In other words, the kind of problem that Josh Lerner laid out more than a decade ago, and one that I feel in my own experience is something that many research parks continue to engage with, is how can we grow through accelerating not simply the residency rate of the park, or whether or not we've kind of earned back our return this year, or have a collaborative, good, productive relationship with our university partners, but how can we actually accelerate an ecosystem? And that was the problem that myself, Professor Fiona Murray, as well as some other people at MIT engaged on about a decade ago when we founded the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. And I will say that back in the when we started the program, we were building on a bunch of research we had done both on a global basis, but also at MIT. But we've been really fortunate over the past, over the past decade to be joined to have a whole wide range of both faculty, people within the REAP program, as well as colleagues around MIT who have really contributed to an effort to really kind of get down to kind of root causes, to develop systems level thinking and modeling around this, and to really hold ourselves accountable to how we create impact at scale. And we've also had the experience of now, and Laura talked about this briefly, of working with more than 60 regions around the world. And I will say that I can see just from your bios that you come from a very diverse range of regions, and some of those are places where sometimes you might say, oh, I'm not sure if our region can really grow or so, right? One of our regions that perhaps my favorite of all time was when we had the opportunity to work with the region of Yakutsk in Siberia. Yakutsk is a city of 300,000 people that is literally on permafrost. It's the largest permafrost city in the world. Obviously, climate change, a big issue there. When I got to visit in December of 2018, it was about minus 57 degrees. I can't remember if that was Fahrenheit or Celsius, but at that temperature, it doesn't really matter, does it? And in some sense, the question was, how can a region that is aspirational, that wants to move forward, how do we take the assets of our region and channel them into the power and potential impact of innovation and entrepreneurship at scale? And at the core of the kind of REAP model is the notion that the challenge that Josh Lerner laid out in Boulevard and Broken Dreams is that very often the efforts to promote innovation and entrepreneurship in a geographic and a place-based way often have a lot of good elements, but they don't really have a systemic theory of change. And within our work, what we've identified are sort of three core elements. And if you get these three elements together, you have a much higher chance of successfully being able to navigate towards an innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem. System, strategy, and stakeholder are three S's. So the first element, and we'll just kind of talk about all these in more detail, but sort of our first element is really to think about the role of the people involved who, by their role, their institutional role, might be able to push a big effort forward. There are multiple of these actors within any given ecosystem. So of course we bring lots of people together, and I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with either hosting or going to meetings where lots of people come together from different stakeholder perspectives. But very often then what happens is that we fail at a system level. We don't have a shared understanding of, even what the goal is or even what the as-is state is. For example, people say, oh, we need more innovation. Well, what do you mean by innovation? We need more entrepreneurship. What kind of entrepreneurs, and kind of how would we track and measure that over time? But imagine we could get those stakeholders together and somehow develop a detailed understanding of the current as-is state of the system. Well, that's great if you're, say, an academic and just want to write a report that you can put on a shelf, but without actually translating the insights that come from that understanding shared by those stakeholders into an integrated set of strategic priorities that themselves can be implemented, you're unlikely to have impact. But it's by bringing together stakeholders, developing a shared systemic understanding, and using that to set priorities through strategy and implementation that we can see and guide and chart a path towards an innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem. So let me just start with a kind of really obvious idea that, however, I think is a really useful insight when one has discussions in this area. No one is in charge of entrepreneurship. Let me repeat that. No one is in charge of entrepreneurship. There are many actors that play an important role at shaping opportunity, at shaping the potential for entrepreneurs in their region. And of course, entrepreneurs themselves have to ultimately be the engine that drives change. But relative to, and I know many of you come from a research park background, right? You have lots of control to a certain degree over what you do with particular for shared facilities. You get lots of control over how to price particular pieces of land or to build particular pieces of infrastructure, right? The universities themselves have a large control over their admissions processes, their curriculum, so on and so forth. However, when it comes to this more ecosystem stuff, no one is in particular is in charge. There are lots of people who have a veto, lots of people make a difference, and lots of people, if they stand back and don't do anything, efforts by others will be less impactful, but no one is directly in charge. And so in some sense, the first and central problem of accelerating an innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem is empowering stakeholders. Let me just kind of give you an example. Many of you are, might have visited or are familiar with the city of Melbourne, one of the most livable cities in the world on a global level. Great place, great universities, great companies around. And the government of Australia, as well as the state government, as well as the city government, had decided to undertake essentially a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project. They were going to build out a kind of light rail system for what they were called an innovation in the Melbourne Innovation District, okay? And the Melbourne Innovation District was going to connect their two main kind of anchor universities in that particular area of the city, the University of Melbourne and RMIT, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. And, between those two areas, traditionally, there were some creative coffee shops and, kind of creative class type venues, but it was a pretty disorganized economic structure. And what the team, I remember they came, as part of the REAP program, and there were all these different interests about, they were definitely going to spend the $1 billion on infrastructure, right? Which is a good topic in the United States these days. But the question was, what was going to be the human innovation and entrepreneurship overlay that enabled innovation and entrepreneurship over that physical infrastructure? And that was something that we were able to work with them. And it really involved some tough conversations, because not every plan that might be good for University of Melbourne was good for RMIT. And actually, in the first few meetings, guess who had they forgotten to talk to? The entrepreneurs, right? So really kind of like going through that process rigorously and systematically makes a big difference. Let me give you just one other example. We had a team from Tokyo a few years ago, and we held one of our cohort meetings within Tokyo. So we had 8, kind of a global meeting of 8 teams. And they used that to launch what was called the Tokyo Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center at the Tokyo University of Science. And at the reception for the opening of that center, we realized about halfway through that it was the first time that the presidents of the 5 major Tokyo universities in Tokyo had ever been in the same room together. Right? University of Tokyo, a very prestigious global university, they don't get involved with the riffraff from maybe the more vocationally oriented university, and the engineering university doesn't talk to the humanities or the law university, ... Oh my goodness. But actually just getting the right people in the room on a topic of shared interest is itself one of the main challenges in promoting innovation-driven entrepreneurship. No one in charge, but each stakeholder plays a critical role. Okay, we bring people together. And once again, I think, as Laura said, this is a topic that I think, has been infused, and a lot of people talk about stakeholder management now. But very often what that means is we all come together for a nice meeting and then nothing happens. The question is why? And the first reason why is because very often, even well-intentioned stakeholder engagement has people just talking past each other in terms of what they're trying to achieve and what is even the as-is state of their system. And in the breakout rooms, we're going to ask you to talk a little bit about your own assessment of your system in a number of ways, right? For example, just to kind of give you one kind of really core thing that we talk a lot about in REAP is this is Bill Allett, the managing director of the Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship and professor of the practice at MIT, as well as Fiona Murray. I'm the associate dean for innovation and the co-director of the MIT Innovation Initiative. And a number of years ago, Bill and Fiona wrote an article that was sort of grounded in academic research, but I think really had it kind of centered within the kind of world of entrepreneurship-led development, which is just to kind of make a very simple point, which is that when we talk about promoting entrepreneurship in a given region, in a given location, we often don't distinguish as clearly as we might between the vast majority of entrepreneurs whose goal and whose businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises. Obviously, over the last year, in the context of the pandemic, we've undertaken tremendous effort to make sure that those mom and pops, those small businesses have been able to be sustained and survive through this incredible disruption. But interestingly, while small, medium-sized enterprises play a kind of critical role in the life of our cities in providing services, they have a different type of impact than those innovation-driven enterprises. These are companies that, for example, once you start them, you very often have to invest very significant capital for a long period of time. There's a much more foundational level of uncertainty as you sort of try to connect idea to impact, try to go from inception to scale. And ultimately, there's a lot of work that sort of suggests that it's ultimately these IDEs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, are ultimately this kind of important engine for regional economic job creation, but they're sort of really rare relative to the underlying SME environment that we're in. And once again, this is on a continuum, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but it's really important just to kind of say, okay, are you really going for an SME strategy? And there's nothing wrong with that. Or are you really about promoting IDs, and what's the relationship and interdependencies between the two? For many of the regions that we work with, one of the kind of key questions, and I assume within many of the research parks that you're involved in, is where do these IDs come from? How is it that some places seem to produce a much higher level of more impactful startups that then grow to scale? I think of Research Triangle Park, and you have a company like Cree that was grounded in the university, moved into the research park, and ultimately became a large employer in the region. Triangle Park Research RTP has a lot of that going on over a long period of time. Other places have been less successful in creating that economic engine. And what we do is we draw on a bunch of work with our own and others, really distinguish some key elements of the underlying, the kind of foundations of an innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm just kind of very high level, is kind of talk at one big distinction we try to draw out is the difference between innovative capacity, the ability, and you're all from research parks, so very often you have a great technical base, a great ability to come up with new ideas, lots of energy from students and faculty and postdocs, just kind of coming up with the best stuff. But does that translate to entrepreneurial capacity, the ability to found and scale organizations? There's not much in engineering school that tells you how to build a company. And there's not much in business school that tells you how to bring an idea to impact. How do you bring those key elements of ICAP and ECAP, innovative capacity and entrepreneurial capacity, together to form a vibrant, innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem? One of the things we do is we try to break that into kind of core elements, and then also think about the ways that they are linked together. One of the things we've observed, and I'd say, this is a surprise as we've worked with these teams across the globe over the past decade is how many very, already strong regions really identify that the critical gap is that they've got innovators and they maybe even have a bunch of entrepreneurs, but those groups do not talk to each other. They don't go to the same watering holes. They're in different social networks. They may not have areas, a way to communicate and find and grow companies through their interaction, right? And so here's a really good example of, we work with Team Southwest Norway, very prosperous region, an oil producing region in Southwest Norway. And one of the kind of key insights is they realized that they had fantastic innovation resources. They had lots of infrastructure. But interestingly, they needed a wholesale revision to entrepreneurial education. And they embedded that entrepreneurial education in a way that connect them to the innovators and also some of the technological resources and infrastructure of the region, right? So kind of throwing this out there, I know that you're all on mute, but maybe we can even, right, just maybe throw in the chat a few examples of how does your region, how does your park and the activities of the organization that you lead or are part of contribute to that linkage, right? So how do you link your innovators and entrepreneurs right now? And I know we have great, right, people all around. So just throw a few things in the chat and I might call on one or two of you. This is in some sense easier and harder than Brian's quizzes that I got wrong. I really felt like any thoughts there?
And I'm looking in the chat to try to see feedback, so please give it. Some of us have I-Core programs, which is one of the ways we work with faculty members and students to do customer validation, assess the market, not just the technology. Maybe there's some examples of that you can share or other similar programs. Yep,
absolutely. And Laura, great point, right? There's a really kind of first order thing, right? Right, early stage funding, Leah Burton, very, very good. Early stage funding opportunities for faculty inventors. That's something we see at an increasing number. Networks to Capital from Allison Madden. Very good. I love, and I-Core is a really good example. We actually, and some of this comes out of the REAP program, we actually had a PhD student whose thesis was looking at those I-Core nodes that many of you are involved in and the positive impact that I-Core nodes have had on basically taking idea to impact. And I can sort of direct you to some of that research. Brian, very good. Joint programs between business and engineering, right? I love it. And Laura, right? So Laura Fryricks, I think it is. So what do you do to help faculties with EIRs? Just maybe if you could kind of add into this.
So we tend to choose entrepreneurs and residents that have experience building companies already that are deep tech companies. And those journeys are at least translatable to our researchers on campus. So it's different if you have an entrepreneur coming in and they did a digital or consumer business and they're trying to talk about that. So what was it? Or there are lectures that'll happen and they'll talk about, this is why Apple was successful. It doesn't really work. It's really more about trying to understand something that came out of a research lab of how do we get that to the marketplace, at least in our ecosystem. Or for students, how do you create a successful new endeavor? Yep. And many of them are really stuck on what I put, technology in search of a market. And so there's a little bit of a breakdown that has to happen, that the customers are not just going to buy it because it's got a paper written on it. You have to really work hard at customer discovery and sales. And that's one of the things that EIRs help to shape. And I think there's some discussion of others on this too, of how the student entrepreneurship might differ than faculty entrepreneurship. Leah mentions their role at NC State in that as well.
Oh, great. So Leah, you're at NC State?
Leah, yes. Jump in, Centennial Campus.
Yeah. Okay. So what are you doing at NC State? We'll just kind of throw a few more things in there.
Well, I think we made a move several years ago to have an entrepreneurship focus for our students that would be, you know, across all of our colleges. I mean, it started in the College of Engineering, and then, you know, I mean, there was an immediate recognition that there's students who want to create their own companies, whether they're in engineering or not, right? And so we expanded upon that. But we also now have a student entrepreneurship garage, if you will, you know, a place for them to test out their ideas, do pitch sessions, yes, meet with, you know, entrepreneurs in residence, and it's co-located with a co-working space on Centennial campus where you know, companies that don't happen to be student-based are starting.
Very, 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 very cool. And I love what's happening in the chat as well. I see we've got even Huntsville and other things in there. Just absolutely great. The core point here is there's a bunch that's already happening, right? You know, I love all this. I love that, right? And, you know, we have the I-Corps, right? Different elements of that portfolio. We could do a lot of double clicking on, you know, which of those pieces work? What are the kind of best practices? What's the role of different kind of, as I think Laura spoke to, that kind of connection between technology and search of market, and then maybe, right, you know, kind of students who are doing customer discovery, but maybe need to more connection to our innovators, right? Need more, you know, connection to our engineers. Totally great. Okay. So love all this, but interesting, I want to add at least one more layer, which is the role of comparative advantage, right? Is that very often what we find is that, and I think, you know, even there was a bit of a hint of this already, right? I love from Stanley, right? It's to be part of the community. What we often find is that if somebody comes up with a great idea, even coming out of university research or an app or whatever it might be, that might be a reason to found a company in a particular place, but that's not a reason to stay in that place. The question is, how do the clusters that we're a part of, the regions we're a part of, the communities we're a part of, both contribute to identifying new opportunities with potential for impact, and as well anchor the ability of that impact for those companies to kind of continue to grow in the region. Along with a kind of range of researchers, Mike Porter from the Harvard Business School, Mercedes Delgado, as well as a series of other collaborators, one of the things that I had been involved with, this was kind of both just before the REAP program, but then over the first half of this decade, was really a large project on really identifying the central role that our clusters play in regional economic development in the United States and around the world. And one of the things that kind of came out of that was people have been talking about clusters for a long time, but it turns out that our clusters are really important as growth drivers for regions throughout the United States. And I would love, if I had more chance to talk to our friends from Huntsville, is a wonderful example of a region that's done pretty well around that, is to really understand how we go from a strong clusters, both lead to a higher level and impact of innovation, higher level growth and survivability of startups, and those themselves then are drivers of overall kind of top line regional economic performance, right? And one of the things we've had a great opportunity to do in REAP, as Laura said right at the beginning, looking at all these regions around the world, is to really kind of get down and dirty with kind of what do we actually mean by comparative advantage and clusters in all these different places around the world. One of my favorite is we had a team from Morocco, not a particularly advanced economy, not a particularly prosperous place, right? Lots of challenges, socio-political challenges. But their core asset is phosphate. They are the largest producer of phosphate, of global exporter of phosphate in the world. They have tremendous natural resources around that. And they came in, they were like, oh, we're going to do digital Morocco, whatever. But then over time, they realized that they needed was to say, how do we connect this tremendous thing owned by a big, very administratively well-run, state-run company? How do we connect that to our entrepreneurs, our innovators, and our universities? They ended up doing an event, which sounds so obvious, like as soon as you think about it. They did Hacking Phosphate, which was the first opportunity they had ever had outside of the state-owned company to really bring together the community. And some were university researchers, some were entrepreneurs, some were expats who actually flew back from the United States or Europe to participate in this, to really figure out novel ways to make Morocco but they wanted to be the Houston of phosphate, really build up the innovation infrastructure around the natural resource, right? And I guess one question I have for you, maybe I really actually can go. Where was our good friend? So Aaron from Huntsville, I'd be interested in Huntsville. You have this unbelievable infrastructure around space. I've been thinking about that for the last few days for a variety of reasons. What do you do? How do you kind of fit your own activities? I know you're one of the biggest research parks in the world. How do you kind of fit the legacy of Huntsville and as well the current activities there within, NASA is not well known for, right, entrepreneurship, right? You know what I'm saying? Like maybe historically. So Aaron, what do you do around that?
Rocket City, Aaron, and then maybe bio too.
That's right. That's right. So one of the things, I mean, you mentioned, Scott, the legacy of our aerospace and defense, and our research park was founded around that. And so we have, a significant portion of our companies are doing that. But what that's led to is other technology innovations through our incubators and through IRAD programs in the companies. And that kind of innovation and entrepreneurial activity has led to what Laura mentioned in regards to biotech growth, and that, growth that we have at Hudson Alpha, and there are 40 associate companies. And so you start to get this genesis of innovative capacity and capability building that becomes, cross-cutting across the different industries. That's fantastic.
That's fantastic. And I it's a really good example where, in some sense that's both something that's happening going forward, but also this incredible historical legacy. And the question kind of really interesting is how do you build on that legacy to chart a path forward into emerging technical areas? Do you see what I'm saying? And emerging opportunities for entrepreneurship. And, once again, lots more to be done there. Ultimately, clusters are the fulcrum around which a region realizes the potential from its innovation and entrepreneurial capacity. A different question we often see in REAP, and one that I know, particularly I think research parks face all the time. This goes, I will say, I'm going to show you a piece of research that we've done around this, a big research project, but it really came directly from working within the REAP program. In our first cohort, I was talking to a senior minister from Finland, and she said, I like all this, I get it, we need to do more entrepreneurship. At that time, Finland had a lot less entrepreneurship. They had this Nokia legacy for a long time. They were trying to figure out kind of their post-Nokia strategy. And she said, my question for you is, okay, suppose we make this big effort to really try to build our innovation and entrepreneurial capacity, invest in comparative advantage, build these programs. How would I know if I was successful, even if it was working? And I said, you'd see economic growth over the long run. And then she looked at me and she said, Scott, well, I plan not to be dead by then, but at very least retired. So how would I get at a more granular level and a real-time level to understand what my entrepreneurial ecosystem actually looks like? And I kind of posed that question to a doctoral student of mine, Jorge Guzman. And in his dissertation, what he did is he developed a new approach for thinking about how to map and measure entrepreneurship in a real time at an arbitrary level of geographic and temporal granularity. And he had kind of three big insights, and some of this work is joint with me as, well, I'll come back to that in just a second. His first insight was that, well, to kind of grow a business, you probably have to register it at some point. Many of you are probably involved in that process at some point. And so, right, and state level, at least in the United States, state level business registers are public documents. So that was a source of data that no one had really used before in as deep a way. And he was able to kind of start acquiring data related to new business registries. Second insight was that, remember we talked about those SMEs versus IDEs? Well, those kinds of companies tend to do very different things right from their moment of founding, right? So if you are Scott's Pizza, you're probably some guy named Scott who wants to sell some pizza. What growth would look like is maybe building a second, Scott's Pizza 2, which is of course important for maybe local, Main Street development. But if I kind of found thermonuclear biotech, I'm probably going to fail because entrepreneurship is risky, but at least I was trying, right? That's the potential. And so there are very big differences we can see in terms of the digital signature at the moment of founding of companies. And then, of course, some firms do grow. We all know who Amazon is today because they're right one of the, if not the largest company in the world, right? And so what we could do is create a predictive analytic model, not causal, just prediction, that sort of looks at those rare success events as a function of those digital signatures within the population of all business registrants. And so just to kind of give you some, right, this is for essentially all businesses in the United States, or in 49 states over a 40-year period. Just going to give you some like fun facts. If you name the firm after yourself, right, the firm is named after the founder, Scott's Pizza, 70% less likely to have kind of explosive growth that results either in an IPO or acquisition, or in very similar would be if you'll get more than 500 or 1,000 employees within the first 8 years. Interestingly, companies that get a trademark are about 300% more likely to grow. More importantly, firms that are grounded in that, right, who acquire or apply for a patent within their first 6 months and register in Delaware. That's a kind of higher level of corporate governance. I'm sure many of you sort of tell your entrepreneurs to do that as kind of standard practice if you're looking for external capital. Those firms are 8,300% more likely to grow. And so that actually lets you, right? And so once you have that predictive analytic, you can then kind of go and do prediction on firms over time or within a given location to look at who's getting started and what's the growth potential of those organizations. And so, just in the interest of time, let me just kind of skip to the movie here, right? So this is the area, some of you will be familiar with this area just around MIT and Cambridge. This is the adjacent zip codes. What you can see is that the size of each of the bubbles is equal to the number of businesses founded in that location per year. The color, more orangey, right? The darker it gets, the more growth potential. And what you can see is that there's actually kind of two regions being mapped here. One is the area kind of to the kind of top left, and that top left region has a lot of kind of, kind of white dots, kind of little starry night. That starry night area is where the bars are, pizza shops, shawarma, accountants, things like that. But the kind of area to the kind of towards the right, that's the kind of Kendall Square area. And specifically that big orange dot, kind of the biggest one, that's in fact the particular location of the Cambridge Innovation Center, which some of you might know is this kind of dedicated building for startups immediately outside of MIT's campus. And so what this lets you do is kind of almost see your ecosystem in a real-time basis, right? Just so you know, the kind of work, let me just go back here, right? This work is available on something that we call the Startup Cartography Project. Molly, if you could just put that in the chat, that'd be great. You can find all of the startups in your region from 1988 through 2016, and then we're going to be doing kind of a big initiative to kind of bring that up even more today, once again, at a very kind of granular level, a high level of granularity. And just kind of one other point is to note is that one of the things that kind of we've shown in this work is really that quantity of entrepreneurship actually doesn't help you so much with economic growth. But once you account for, if you're able to get that quality adjusted quantity, that's actually a big predictor of economic growth. We're able to kind of look at particular initiatives. And actually, this is my most recent paper with Valentina Totari, really showing the impact of our university research partners on the entrepreneurial ecosystems themselves. And there's just a tremendously high return from federally funded research projects on entrepreneurship within our ecosystems. Okay, I recognize that I'm, as usual, a few minutes behind, but not too bad, right? So one of the things that you want to kind of think about is the role that these metrics play in kind of thinking through how to bring accountability to your stakeholders as you kind of understand the evolution of this system over time. And the question is, what are you bringing accountability to? And that's the final piece of our 3S framework, right? Many of you I know will have both prepared, implemented strategy in many different contexts. We know that. But one of the kind of interesting things is that once you acknowledge that this stakeholder perspective is important and that this is a long-term game, maintaining strategy is really hard. Getting people from leveraged institutions to agree on some shared priorities and actually move the system forward is one of the things we find with lots of regions around the world, kind of perhaps the most critical challenge they face in going from idea to impact. One of the things we found kind of very helpful is a framework due to Mark Kramer and his colleagues. Interestingly, there's not a Mark Kramer and his colleagues at FSG, where they really talk about the role of collective impact. They really think about kind of what are the preconditions and what are the processes that allow stakeholder governance to be more effective. Real focus on shared metrics and evaluation, but also stakeholder engagement and communication, and also the kind of appropriate level of resource and support for what they call those backbone organizations that allow the strategy to be implemented. Very often the strategy is announced, lots of exciting individual initiatives, but there's no kind of organization that owns the process going forward. And so the implementation and scaling of this regional strategy, less developed, right? Ultimately, one of the things that we've really tried to highlight is that effectively using a stakeholder approach, undertaking the systems level thinking, allows you to choose an innovator-based, entrepreneur-led value proposition. And then there's a whole series of policies, programs, and practices that kind of, right, and we already talked about some of them, whether or not, right, maybe sometimes an accelerator is the thing that's missing from your ecosystem. Maybe it's a commercialization program. Maybe it's much more upstream, a real kind of tough tech, kind of really working with, kind of faculty research and federally funded research. Maybe it's a kind of a competition to see, right, can we take all this great stuff people are creating and actually build companies out of it, right? Ultimately, the first step is choosing and winning that must-win battle. When you bring stakeholders together, very often the hardest part is for those, everyone will show up to one meeting because they're polite, because they like you, because they're doing a favor. But sustaining stakeholder governance requires those individuals to see a reason to engage. And very often winning a short win that then drives the rest of the strategy both allows that group that's come together to not only have a direct impact, but also sustain itself through that sense of shared accomplishment, shared commitment, and legitimacy. Right? Just to give you I'm going to give two very quick examples. One, this is all the way back to cohort 1. We worked with a group in Scotland, very similar to many of you here. There is a large set of economic development activities already underway. And I remember Donna Chisholm, who was the head of business innovation and growth in Highlands and Islands Enterprise. She sort of was very upfront. She said, we have a budget. We are already spending money promoting entrepreneurship in Scotland. My question is, are we spending it on the right things? And it was, and then she undertook through the stakeholder approach something that apparently had not been done before in Scotland, is she actually convened the entrepreneurs and said, what are really the challenges you face? And really kind of got deep on personas and understanding what those entrepreneurs actually needed. And all of a sudden that allowed them to really develop a different strategy and approach, and one that ultimately paid dividends for the region over time. Let me just kind of, hold on, right? Let me just kind of finish and move us back to the Macquarie Park Innovation District. This is Paul Hogan. He is the academic lead from the Macquarie Park. This is exactly the kind of problem that we faced in a number of times. There's an existing set of players. They've kind of worked together pretty productively already. Things are not, there's no crisis here, but they know they're not able to get as much as they could out of going from being a research park to an innovation district. And one of the things that one second. oh, sorry, okay, is that one thing that the team in Macquarie was able to do was really moving on a few key dimensions by, and I think this came out in the chat, is a research park a place for businesses or is it a community? Is it something where each actor that influences the park should be good at what they do, but left to themselves? Or should there be a regional park strategy? Should the emphasis be on any technology, any innovation, any initiative, or should the park itself be trying to both cohere and accelerate and invest in the comparative advantage of the region? Okay, we have lots of other examples. Let me just note that across all of those, and I'll say this as my background is as an economist, I will say that as a economist and somebody who's tried to work with economic developers for a long time, is I think one of the kind of really big insights that we've gotten from REAP, and I know I think this is not our own unique insight, but I think it's an important one, is that the thing that was missing in the prior generation of economic development strategy was that people wanted strategies, but they were not as engaged with thinking about the role of systemic stakeholder engagement in shaping the success and scaling of those strategies over time. Right? I'll leave you on kind of a little bit of a strategic note to say, one thing you might think about as we kind of go into the breakouts is kind of what's your strategy for the short term or long term. And of course, we're always open to listening. We always get feedback on this and just love to hear more about it. I'm going to turn it back to Laura and also to Molly, who I think are going to bring us to next step to kind of put this to work within some breakout groups and a good exercise.
Great. And I did see a question related to that last slide you just had, Scott, for Leah's question from NC State. The short-term versus long-term, many of us play a role in the early stage of companies, but sometimes struggle to retain them in our ecosystem. So maybe we can discuss in breakouts, but I'd love your reaction to that too.
Yeah, let me just say that the easiest part of that, and I can show you, we have a kind of body, there's a whole body of work we've done on sort of entrepreneurs who move, and that was actually Jorge's dissertation, was I would make the point that that is one of the kind of unexamined or sort of underemphasized pieces of clusters and comparative advantage in community is that there are two parts you have to get right. You have to give people a reason to found and a reason to stay. And very often when you can make that connection between what the startup is doing and that they're better off on their own terms stay, and very often that itself is grounded in comparative advantage and community. And I could talk for a long time around that, but I know we're short on time, and I also recognize that I've sort of overstayed my time.
Okay, Molly, let's bring them back to time. I think you're going to transition us to breakouts.
Yes, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Laura. I'll just pull up our agenda for the next bit. Scott, if I could ask you to take down your screen share.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Done.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go into a 10-minute break now. When we'll, 15-minute break, we'll ask you to actually use this time to individually reflect on the worksheet. Vicki shared it by email this morning, and we've just put it in the chat again. This will give you some reflection questions on those core REAP concepts of comparative advantage and stakeholders. Questions so you can reflect on your own research park and organization. After this 15 minutes, you'll go into small group breakouts to discuss your thoughts from your own research park with each other and learn from each other. That will be about a 25-minute discussion, and then we'll come back for a wrap up with Professor Stern. So with that, we'll begin our break. And please do use the reflection sheet, take down some notes, and we'll see you in the breakout rooms.
You want?
Sure, sure, Laura. Well, let me start with not Carol. That's Carol, you bought yourself a world of trouble. Okay. So let me start here. Aaron, you were kind of leading the discussion a little bit in the group I was in. So why don't I just kind of start with the part that I missed, which is first on the comparative advantage. How much, what did you learn, kind of from your perception, where does your research park, and what do you, what's your sense of how others are kind of engaged with their clusters with comparative advantage in the region? Sorry to call on you first there.
Looking at the other three, as you said, I was more the therapist of the group. I didn't really say much. I was listening to the others. It is interesting, the different answers we get out of this. It's everything from their own in-house strengths. For instance, Allison was speaking about the facility she has and just how expensive it is to replicate some of those pieces, and she has a very close proximity to the university. We had a nice discussion about that. But then you speak to Kate in terms of some of the key assets that she has in her community with the national labs, the military presence, and so forth. And it sounds like they really want to be proactive, could be more proactive on the military side, but still they want to help develop this economy locally. And there's some inherent strengths between the two of them, secondary strengths, I guess you would say. And then Greg, again, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were relying more on your the key university strengths, if I remember right. So I just look for the one with the beard. That's good now. Okay. So it's a nice diversity that we had in the group. That was nice. It was fun.
Yeah, no. Let me get Greg. What do you mean you're relying on the university? You just kind of maybe play that out for us.
Well, we were the diversity of strengths that being a research university had. We were bringing things in from all over the world, and frankly, there's nothing within an hour of us until we get to Indianapolis. So I mean, it's we would jokingly say that we're 10 minutes from corn in any direction is something we would chuckle at. But there was this huge innovation hub that's happening out here, and so if one of the things that kind of happened was a sweat equity. If we wanted to make it happen, well, we had to put your nose to the grindstone and make it happen. And that's kind of been right.
So it's almost like it's a kind of a human capital kind of flywheel.
Yeah.
Right. Kind of builds up, mentor, right. And then, that's kind of breeding on that. That's or building on that. That sounds fantastic. Let me turn, maybe I'm not sure if you remember which group. How about, I see Brooke Godair. Brooke, I'm not sure if you're able to unmute.
Yep, Brooke Geddert here. So I was in a group with Leah. They're at NC State, and she really focused on their geographic close proximity to some other research parks as being their comparative advantage. One of their strengths that they know and they feel that they're really good at is faculty entrepreneurship. So getting their university faculty lab space, office space, making sure that they have the equipment that they need. They feel like that they do that really well. And then we went into kind of an interesting discussion of kind of a new way. She had told a story about a Latino woman being an entrepreneur and going in front of some pre-seed folks for funding, and she was just kind of upset by the way that she was treated, and she just didn't feel valued as the CEO of that company. And so it went on to where she actually left and moved out of state for another opportunity. So we kind of alluded into a discussion of maybe how that could be overcome in some ways to make sure that that isn't happening again. So I know Leah was still gonna kind of explore, kind of really pinpointing that down. But that was kind of our discussion there for the first half.
Yeah, no, I mean, what's amazing is, at one level, if you just, hear various programs to promote, both women and people from, various communities, kind of becoming entrepreneurs, there's still just such kind of challenges. One of the kind of interesting, our colleague Fiona Murray had this experiment where they had women and men entrepreneurs both give exactly the same pitch to investors. And it turns out that and then they would ask the investors, who are of course pretty predominantly male, would you invest in this company? And dramatic differences at, kind of in terms of the much more likely to invest in the actually handsome men was the best thing you could be. And actually the least likely was actually to be an attractive woman. That was actually right. And they did a whole body of work around that. Just, and in part that notion of how we make our investor community inclusive, that's a particular role that institutional actors can bring, right? So sometimes the investor community a little bit less engaged on that issue, but as institutional actors, very often we can start spearheading programs and getting people engaged to hopefully reverse that dynamic. Leah, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to what Brooke said, I thought fairly eloquently, but just on that particular experience.
Well, I'm trying not to be the big mouth. So I wanna hear, maybe hear back from Brooke or some of her colleagues about the Combine at Nebraska Innovation Campus, because I just love that new space that they created and all the opportunities that really speak to the strengths that they have in Nebraska. And yeah, I don't want to be the big mouth here. I'm gonna pass it on.
Okay. Brooke, stand up for the Combine. What are you doing there? And who came together to build that? I love the name.
Sure. Yep. So the Combine Incubator is a newer incubator. It's about 1.5 years old, but it's a public-private ag and food tech incubator. We're located here in Lincoln, so obviously agriculture is what we're known for. And so these entrepreneurs can locate here on campus or join as a virtual participant. So we have reach across the state where they can connect producers for these startup companies to really provide a key resource for kind of these problems that they're solving and get some early feedback on some of these solutions that they've come up with. So that's that was under our umbrella of an existing way that we're currently leveraging our region's advantage. So
that's
thank
great.
you.
But that's a relative, and let me ask you a different question, Brooke, and then I'll turn, but let me just ask you one more here. Why do you think it took until 2019 to get that? Just, I'm interested, just kind of like, and I'm sure you yourself or others within your organization had to push pretty hard to, kind of stand something like that up. Was it just lack of awareness, or were there some barriers, or just required the right group of people to come together?
Dan's on the call too. He may be able to add a little bit of color to this. Probably two things. One's going to be the space physically on campus. We needed to have a space for them to build out. We didn't really have the space initially in our buildings. And then secondly, just the funding of getting it up off the ground as well, and getting the right folks in the room to make the idea happen. So.
Yep, absolutely. So we've seen
I
that.
will add a bit to that, because I think it's germane to this. Is about 6 years ago, we started a meeting with the Department of Economic Development, Invest Nebraska, the City of Lincoln's economic development people, and the university, mostly so we didn't trip over each other going into companies. And out of that, we ended up putting together a program for a wet lab incubator and the Combine, where all the partners came together. but it took a while to coalesce, and it kind of, I think, drives home the point you've been trying to make, Scott.
Yeah.
It's
Let me ask you,
community.
and let me ask you a question. How do you measure success? That's a hard question, but sometimes it's like, how would you know?
Yeah, well, you know, we have, I think the success measure for a new incubator is people want in, right? And, you know, we've got some companies that are coming out and getting investment. You know, and some of them are getting significant investment. So you know, that's a measure of success, I think, for something this young.
Yep, absolutely. No, I'm just, I wanted to sort of, I know that's a challenging area. One of the interesting things, and there's some great work by Yael Hochberg at Rice as well, some of her co-authors, it sort of hints that actually, if you get the right kind of accelerator, really grounded in comparative advantage, you not only see the impact is not just through the program, but it kind of inspires others, and there's more venture capital availability in the region. So you see kind of a rising tide lift all the boats, and some sense it kind of amplifies that impact. So, but just really, really cool. Let me kind of turn it over, and I recognize Molly. I can see Molly. How many more minutes do we have here?
We have until 25 past.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Maybe turn it to another group that hasn't yet talked. Will Germain is down in you're in my right-hand corner, Will. What do you guys talk about in your group? Either comparative advantage or stakeholder. Oh, Will might be hard. We'll maybe come back. How about
Will's group?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Anyone else from Will's group? Or Will? Oh, Will was there in spirit. Okay, very, very, very good. How about turning it over to Laura Bile. Sorry, my current screen has literally died this morning, so you all have a red little tint, but so it makes it a little harder to see. But okay, Laura, what did you discuss in your group? Where are you in Illinois first?
I am also at the University of Illinois Research Park in Champaign.
Ah, very excellent. Oh, did we hear from somebody else who was at Illinois before? Oh, that's Laura. Okay, very good. Okay.
Yes, there are two of us.
Okay.
Same name.
You'll talk ag tech, which I didn't in this session.
Yes.
Okay. So Laura, help us out. So tell us a little bit about ag tech, and tell us a little bit how you're bringing together those cultures.
We talked about, well, we did talk ag tech a little bit, but actually we focused probably more of our discussion around the challenge of scaling our life sciences company, whether they're an ag biotech or medical life sciences. Regardless, of course, that dovetails with some of our ag tech work. But the challenges I think that many of our research parks or other like-minded organizations face, which is we have incubator space to launch and help start these companies, and lots of them out there, but getting them to growth stage and facilities, and then of course beyond that is incredibly challenging, and we all have the same challenges related to expense of build out, et cetera. So talking about that and how do we overcome some of those challenges and different strategies that are being seen in our local regions.
Right.
Which,
so
none of which have been very successful.
Well, no. I'm right. So scaling is something that we, and maybe I'll ask either Travis or Molly to comment here. But sort of one of the things that's really been something that we've been involved with in a lot of projects, through REAP, has been these sort of scale, right. So we all can do Lean Launchpad or whatever, whatever your particular brand of vodka is for the early stage customer discovery. We all know what to do with big established firms. But for example, in the UK, for example, REAP helped build out something called Growth Builder. Travis or Molly, I don't know if you want to sort of make a few comments around some of our scaling kind of initiatives.
Sure, I can go first, and Molly, feel free to add. Growth Builder is an interesting initiative for our UK team based in London. that was one of the most significant issues that they saw with the London ecosystem, which is already very vibrant. And the way the approach they took was really to work with big corporates to help them kind of with that international expansion approach. So they worked with a lot of other teams that we had in the program, as well as big corporates, to kind of make that jump out of the UK ecosystem and into Europe in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting part, which is that the kind of science of scaling is something that's sort of itself, you know, a kind of emerging thing. Molly, I'm not sure if you also wanted to kind of make some comments based on your thoughts. I know you just kind of threw a few things in there.
Yeah, I just added the website. I'm going to leave it with Travis's comments, if that's okay.
Okay, you know, I know we're short on time here. Okay, but totally interesting. And let me ask you one last question. Maybe this just kind of maybe put in the chat first, or I'll then call. Is one piece is, you know, I'm who's missing, right? So I'm was really struck by this, by the story that the recounting that Brooke gave of, right, I guess that was in Leah's ecosystem, of an entrepreneur who felt excluded, and maybe even had some very kind of impactful experiences along those lines, and that's a real thing. Kind of, as you sort of think about this, it's really, you know, and one of the things I think that's really easy in economic development, particularly if there's not a crisis, is it's really easy if somebody's not in the room, you sort of say, well, here we've gotten the group here, let's move forward. But have you ever, anyone having any reflection here on people you might, going forward, start to bring into the room or bring into the conversation that maybe to date has been either on the sidelines or just shows up kind of sits there and sits on their hands, or so on and so forth?
And I might pick on Stan Malloy from San Diego State University, because they've had a lot of stakeholder input on their project to redevelop the NFL stadium. And that included discussion with students and the community of what they want to see for the future of that space, which is more than just the research community in San Diego.
Yeah, so what Laura said is really true. We've really reached out to the community. I mean, we consider ourselves part of the community. But the other thing here that I think gets to one of your points, Scott, is we believe very strongly, it's our core value, that diversity promotes innovation, right? Yep. So we really make an active effort to make sure that we're not missing that person at the table, right? And so far we've been really successful. I think it's really an important thing. And I think even though there's a lot of research on the value of diversity and innovation, there's still a lot of people who don't fully accept that.
Right, absolutely. Anyone else? But that's really interesting. And I actually, just before the pandemic, I know you're at SDSU, but I had a chance to spend some time with Pradeep at UCSD and sort of some of the efforts there. I guess those are a little bit separated, but you know, it's kind of really fascinating is, you know, what the energy I think that he's brought to that. But anyone else? Ariella, you've so far been quiet. What are you bringing to the, who's missing from the table? Who's at the table in your ecosystem?
Well, I can throw it up to the group and actually throw it back to last session where we talked about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so in all these conversations, it's awesome, but I haven't heard anyone mention community groups as an example, right? And so, you know, if we want Black founders and if we want female founders, why isn't, so I haven't heard anyone mention community groups. So I'm actually going to throw it out to everybody, you know, have you reached out? Have you engaged? And if not, I think that would be a really important type of stakeholder that should be in the room. And I don't think that they currently are. And you tell me, Scott, in your I and E cap, where do they fit?
Yeah, I think you know, not only do I agree with you, I think that the lens that you're talking about, one is how do we actually measure that? You know what I'm saying? Like, where's that engagement? And then separately, what role, you know what I'm saying, right, what role do community groups, particularly the broader community, play in these kind of relatively specialized initiatives, right? So on the one hand, this group is, right, when you look at your mission statements, your KPIs, they're gonna be how many licenses, how many businesses scaled. And you don't get rewarded for scale, you know what I'm saying, for more diverse workforce. Very often.
100%. And for
Right?
us, for example, at Slido, we always talk about take it from output to outcome to impact to result.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
really think about the cascade.
Yeah, and our colleague and co-director of the REAP program, Fiona Murray, who's not here today, but Fiona has some has really interestingly at MIT, she is the associate dean of innovation and inclusion. Like those are her two, right? And that role, right, has kind of come together. Do you see what I'm saying? Because of that commitment. And one of the things that we have talked about, not within all of our REAP teams, and I would say this, and maybe Travis and Molly and Kelly can speak to this, but sort of it's interesting. I know we're just about out of time, but very often university-driven programs recognize this point, but sometimes when it's been led from the research park level, we've had less of a lens within the team on the role of community groups because of, I think, that kind of fundamental, top line economic performance as being the main KPI, if you see what I'm saying. And so, and then of course, then you sort of show them evidence, show people evidence about the role that diversity plays in promoting economic performance, and you can get people on board. But I think that it's still a pretty long road to hoe. So Ariella, fantastic comments and just really good insight, and something that we work on within REAP, to be honest, within MIT and our ecosystem and within our domain of the university. But I think that it's something that we're just going to be able to enable a lot more, our colleagues, right? If we just had innovation and entrepreneurship by Black and Latina, Latino entrepreneurs, from women entrepreneurs, that would just itself would be the best ingredient we could ever imagine for economic growth going forward for the country. So I recognize that I've overstayed my time as usual. So I'm going to turn it to either Laura or Brian or Molly or Travis, but I'm going to stop here and I'd be happy to take time after.
I thought Dan had an interesting story of working with community groups, and that not everything happens necessarily within the confines of the research park or the university, and his work with an accelerator program that attracted entrepreneurs from even Atlanta. Things that can change when you're in a community like our own, where if geography is not bound in the same way it had been, you might attract new people who you can help support. Picking on you, Dan, but if you don't want to reply to that of your work with G-Beta, you don't have to.
Sure, I just relayed a story that because of the COVID shutdown, we had a generator program where we were bringing entrepreneurs supposedly to Lincoln to start their companies, and they ended up staying where they were. And so we have a really nice company that's being mentored and nurtured actually in Atlanta. From Lincoln, Nebraska. Happens to be a woman founder, happens to be an African-American founder. And it's going to be really interesting because the business will be grown marketing-wise out of Atlanta and probably operationally-wise out of Nebraska. So.
Extend your reach when you can, and it may be that there's 2 cities involved. All right, Molly, did you want to, Kelly, take us in a new direction?
I think over to you and Brian to close us out.
Yeah, Laura, do you want to offer some closing comments as the moderator?
Sure. Okay, thanks. And I'd like to give a special thank you to our guests from MIT REAP program. Thank you for donating your time to us and your expertise. Professor Stern, thanks for sharing your research with us, and the REAP team for sharing insights from your work globally of helping build economies that are driven by innovation and entrepreneurship as 2 perhaps separate capacities that both simultaneously need to grow, and understanding how to better drive stakeholder engagement. There were some great little cliff notes I certainly learned from this session of some of the slides that you shared and some of the research that's been done. So I hope everybody enjoyed these discussions amongst your groups and had a chance to get to know each other better as well. If you're interested in working with REAP, Travis Hunter is the lead for the program and can help you learn more about the work with MIT Sloan School of Management and their REAP initiative to help communities of innovation. This is something core to AURP, building communities of innovation. So I think it was a really good fit for the type of work that all of us do and appropriate for spring training when we all seek to learn from experts and challenge ourselves more. Brian and Vicki, I think, are going to tell us more as we wrap up this AURP spring training conference of some of the conclusions from the month. I'm virtually in front of the Mission Tempe Palms, and I know I'm excited to see everybody in person again. I hope I see you in Utah. So please join us for real in person, not on Zoom, at our next big event. And there's some other ones in between there that I'm sure Brian will tease up a little bit better, but we love having a really inclusive peer community. Thanks for sharing today.
Great. Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for participating. You know, this was a keeping with the metaphor and the theme. This was a walk-off home run as we finish our spring training. I want to thank our speakers, sponsors, and attendees for participating in Spring Training 2021. I want to special thanks to Mark Romney and Will Germain, who are our spring training co-chairs. They helped develop some of the programming, and they led a number of sessions. And I also want to thank Leah for leading the diversity, equity, and inclusion session, and of course Laura for leading this session. I want to remind you to complete the feedback forms of all spring training that have been sent to you and are in the chat. We appreciate you. We would love the feedback, how we can improve. Scott mentioned, what's your metric? So our metric is the feedback forms for what you think worked well and what didn't work so well. I want to mention the international conference coming up, United We Rise. That'll be in October, where we will meet in person. I emphasize in person. And we'll have an online option for some of you. Registration will open shortly. And then I also want to mention, I think we're going to mention the award ceremony. So don't forget to submit nominations for Outstanding Research Park or Innovation District and the other award categories you can see there. They're due on June 18th, and that can be done through the AURP website. Very easily, please submit nominations. So, and I think we also have a slide, our BioHealth Caucus meeting, where we will have 10 states featured on June 8th virtually. And I will have the toughest trivia question ever on my AURP Health Caucus. And we will also have a free SBA webinar on how SBA can help companies in your parks on May 12th. Both of these you can sign up on the AURP website. And next slide. So we're announcing the award winners. The first one I want to remind, Jonathan won the geographic trivia for knowing Connecticut is the nutmeg state. You can Google online why they're known for that. And then the prizes. So the virtual half marathon, the $100 Amazon gift card for the greatest distance goes to Stephen Colston at Perkins and Will. Stephen, there you are. Congratulations. We also have a $75 Amazon gift certificate for the best time, and that goes to Brooke. Congratulations, Brooke. And our $50 Amazon gift card for best photo finish on social media goes to Laura. There she is with her social media posting. Thank you very much. And we also have the $25 Amazon gift card, a random drawing that was won by, next slide, Allison. Congratulations, Allison, for the Amazon gift card. Now we have the grand prize for the attendee with the best overall time being on the spring training. And our group has been monitoring this carefully. And this is at $250 off of the AURP International Conference registration. And the winner of the person who has been most engaged and online the longest for the spring training is Stanley. There you are. Thank you, Stanley, for participating and being our #1 person in terms of being on AURP. With that, I think we are wrapping up, and I appreciate everyone. See you certainly in Salt Lake, but hope to see a number of you at the AURP Biohealth Caucus meeting, our SBA free training session on how SBA can help companies in your parks. And with that, thank you for attending.